Let's spend some time talking about Koch postulates. Koch postulates are a big deal because they're the standard, the gold standard, I should say, for identifying what pathogen causes what disease. And they're important because we need to find the causative agent, what's causing our disease. Now, when we look at Koch postulates, they can be broken down into a series of proofs. These proofs are used all the time. They've been used for over 100 years to identify many diseases. Now, there are specific situations where Koch postulates can't be completely fulfilled, but those are the exceptions. And when we look at these exceptions, because this is an academic class, we're going to spend time focusing on exceptions. These any infectious agent that can't be grown in a laboratory setting really isn't going to work well for Koch postulates. Any infection that can't be elicited in animals isn't going to work well for Koch postulates. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your viewpoint, we don't have many lab people lining up to be injected with random pathogens isolated from random sick individuals. So we use lab rats and lab mice and lab bunnies as a substitute. But some diseases are only going to infect human beings or will be organism specific. So we can't get those diseases cultured in other mammals, even though they are very similar to human beings. And then finally, if there's a disease that's caused by multiple microbes, maybe a virus combined with a protozoa, in those situations, there's multiple microbes or polymicrobial diseases. In those situations, Koch postulates does not work. So Koch postulates needs to work for something that we can grow in a lab setting, that we can cultivate in a lab animal, and that's caused by one microbe. And thankfully, that's most diseases. So first, postulate number one, we need to have some kind of evidence that there's going to be a microbe causing a disease in a selected pool or category of sick individuals. And then we need to, step number two, we need to isolate that infected microbe from the patient. So we typically are going to take a sample from the patient, streak plate it, and then you have a bunch of individual colonies, and then you isolate each individual colony and then test each individual pathogen or microbe. And then you take each individual microbe and inject it in a host organism, typically a lab rat or a lab mouse. And then you watch that lab rat or lab mouse to see what happens. Does that organism develop the same symptoms? And if that healthy organism develops the same symptoms, see if you can re-isolate that pathogen from the same organism. So it's a four-step plan. First, get a pool of sick people, and then step two, isolate the pathogen from the sick people. And then step three, inject it in a lab animal. And then step four, and if the lab animal exhibits the same symptoms, step four, see if you can re-isolate that pathogen from the sick lab animal. Those are Koch postulates. Koch postulates are going to be very essential for epidemiology. Epidemiology is the study of disease in populations. Epidemiology is a field of microbiology that's been rapidly transformed thanks to the information age, where we have the frequency and distribution of diseases being studied with a lot of computer databases now. So if you are thinking of getting a degree in computer science, if you have that degree in computer science, you can use it for a study in epidemiology. It's a very flexible and high demand degree field right now. Although most of you are thinking of being nurses, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about computer science majors. And when we look at epidemiology, it involves a lot of different fields: microbiology, anatomy, physiology, immunology, medicine. It's kind of a smorgasbord career of study or field of study. And it looks at all kinds of diseases: heart diseases, cancer, lung. It looks at STDs, it looks at pathogen, it looks at mental illnesses. Lots of different diseases can be encompassed under the umbrella of epidemiology. The founder or the mother of epidemiology is Florence Nightingale. Yes, Florence Nightingale is a real person. Now, Florence Nightingale laid the foundations for modern epidemiology when she looked at military hospitals, and she found that if you have separate linens and towels for each patient, and you clean the floors and unclog the sewage pipes, that, hey, people don't get sick when they go to the hospitals. And this was done all before the discovery of germ theory. She just found that keeping the place clean reduced the rate of infection. She kept very meticulous notes and demonstrated this, that more men died of disease in a hospital setting than from the traumatic injuries they were incurring in the battlefield. Now, when we apply epidemiology, we use it to track behaviors, such as exercise or smoking. We can then use some clues from the causative agent for the individual and then track the numbers and distribution of cases in a community. So we look at the data. Oh, hello. So we'd like to look at the data and just look at trends. A lot of times these trends, these data points are going to be plotted on a map. And by plotting them on the map to find density or density dependent areas on a map, or the frequency on a map, geographically linked frequency distributions, we can have a better idea of what diseases, whether it's a mental health disease or a cancer or a genetic linked disease, are more common in what areas. Now, to get these data points, we're going to have a good data collection system in place. So we're going to have reportable and notifiable diseases. These are diseases that if a healthcare provider finds, that they're going to need to report to the CDC. Certain diseases must always be reported to the CDC. For example, if you have a patient that has smallpox, you absolutely must report that to the CDC. Other diseases are on more of a voluntary basis. So, for example, does someone have lung cancer? You don't necessarily have to report that to the CDC, but if you want to, cool, I'll give them another data point. Now, as we look at the CDC is going to be on the top of the United States, and then internationally we'll have the World Health Organization, or WHO. Before you get to the CDC, there will be local, district, and state levels that the data is going to be funneled through. Here's a list of all of the reportable diseases in the United States. This is a list that is slightly out of date. It's a little bit longer now because this list is about a year and a half old now. It's also worth emphasizing that this list is not going to be on your test. You do not need to memorize this list. As I'm looking now, when we look at some of the statistics related to epidemiology, we need to race, gender, geographic region. But we also need to know some other key terms that we need to define. One is the mortality rate. This is measures essentially the death toll, not necessarily the total number of people that died, but how many people die in the population due to a certain disease. So this is the total number of deaths related to that disease. Now, when we think of the mortality rate, we can have the death rate from the disease drop and the number of infected people remain high with infectious diseases. And then in this situation, is a high morbidity rate. We also have prevalence. Prevalence is the number of new cases in the population relative to the total population size. So we can have a high morbidity rate. In other words, there's a lot of people in the population that are just infected with disease, and they aren't necessarily transmitting the disease. So these are going to be diseases that you have for a long period of time. Prevalence is going to look at how the disease is spreading through a population. This is going to be expressed as a percentage. And then finally, we have the incidence, also known as the morbidity rate. So this is going to be the number of new death cases in a certain period of time related to the total number of susceptible people. So if we look at prevalence versus incidence, our incidence is going to be expressed per 100,000 people per unit of time. Typically, it's going to be annually. How many people are infected with the disease annually out of 100,000 people? If we look at prevalence, this is going to be the total number of people that, or percentage or fraction of people in the population that develop the disease. So if we look at prevalence and incidence, they're effectively going to show the same thing, but express that information in different ways. One expresses the information as a percentage, the other expresses it as an incidence per 100,000 people. Here are some examples from your textbook of epidemiological data. We can have the reported number of cases being plotted over a year. We can have the incidences of chlamydia and STD patients based on their sexual habits. So we see in the younger age ranges, there's a lot more people developing chlamydia than in the older age ranges. And if we have men having sex with men or men having sex with women, those are going to be a lot of the new cases. And then I'm not necessarily sure what just the women is going to be related to. Maybe women having sex with women. I'm not 100% sure. Oh, I went a little fast there. And then here we can see a plot of a geographic map to see the incidence of infection of malaria geographically across the world. Now, when we look at these epidemiological statistics, some other key terms we need to know are point source, common source, and propagated epidemics. A point source epidemic is going to come from a single source. All victims, so to speak, all people that contract the disease are going to be exposed to this common source. maybe it's it's going to be something like Typhoid Mary, who's going to expose a whole bunch of people to herself and then make them sick. Or maybe there's a poisoned well in the middle of the village. This is going to be a single isolated source of the pathogen or disease. Now, there's also going to be a common source infection. This common source epidemic is going to be resulting from a result from a single exposure or common exposure to a single source over a long period of time. So the point source epidemic is typically going to be linked to a specific point in time. So let's say some poison is dumped in the village well, but that poison will dissipate relatively quickly. A common source of epidemic would be an instance of maybe contaminated sewage continually being pumped into the water supply over a long period of time. And then there's propagated epidemics. Propagated epidemics are going to be transmitted from person to person to person and sustained within the population because they are highly infectious. So, how can you distinguish between point source, common source, and propagated epidemics? Well, you can look at the number of new cases. If the number of new cases is low, spikes up really high, and then goes back down again, that's probably going to be a point source. If the number of new cases is, kind of high and relatively high and constant-ish, and it goes up and then a little back down gradually, that's probably going to be your common source epidemic. And then if that disease can spread from person to person to person in the population, you're going to notice an exponential increase in the number of new cases, at least initially. And then you'll see this sharp spike in the graph if you graph numbers of new cases. Now, when we look at epidemiological statistics, the index case is patient 0, the first patient found to or believed to have had the disease. Now, they may not have been necessarily the first case of the disease, but it's the first case that brought the epidemic to the attention of officials. For example, HIV/AIDS is believed to have originated within Africa. And there's probably a couple years or decades at play there where it was only localized in a few villages within Africa. But then there's the index case, the individual that started spreading it rapidly throughout the rest of the world. If we have an endemic versus sporadic disease, if we compare these two, endemic is going to be a disease that has going to be relatively constant over a long period of time in this particular geographic location. For example, here in Minnesota, Lyme's disease is endemic. It's just not going to go away. And then sporadic diseases are one that pop up and then go away at regular intervals at random locales. For example, influenza, that's typically a seasonal disease. Now, if there's an epidemic is going to be when the disease is going to rapidly increase beyond what's typical for the population. So if all of a sudden every, let's say 50% of the population contracted Lyme's disease within the city of Red Wing within a month, that would be a Lyme's disease epidemic. Now, the time period isn't necessarily defined, but can be measured in hours or years. It depends on a disease-to-disease basis. We need to look at the specific disease and the data we have for that specific disease to determine whether or not we define it as an epidemic. The key thing to remember with epidemics is that there's going to be a rapid increase in the prevalence of the disease beyond what is normally or typically expected. And then we have pandemics. If we have a pandemic, that's going to be the disease spreading across the globe, typically between continents, and an increased incident beyond what is typically going to be expected. So if we have an endemic occurrence, this is going to be just common over a geographic region. Epidemic occurrences are going to be highly localized increases in the disease. Sporadic occurrences are just going to happen without much rhyme or reason. That can be seasonally related, but they're going to be much more isolated. And then pandemic occurs when that epidemic starts to spread between continents. That's all we have for our recording on chapter 11. If you have any questions for me, please feel free to post in the class discussion board or shoot me an email. Happy studies.